The Dreyfus Affair. In 1894, France was consumed by one of the most divisive scandals in military history, the Dreyfus Affair. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a young Jewish officer in the French army, was accused of passing secret artillery documents to Germany. On October 15th, he was arrested in Paris, and by December, after a rushed and secret military trial, he was convicted of treason. Stripped of his rank in a humiliating public ceremony, he was sent into exile on the harsh prison colony of Devil's Island in French Guiana. But doubts quickly surfaced. In 1896, evidence pointed to another officer, Major Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy, as the real traitor. Instead of clearing Dreyfus, the army covered it up, determined to protect its honor. When Esterhazy was acquitted in 1898, outrage erupted. That same year, writer Émile Zola published his famous open letter J'accuse, directly accusing the French government and military of corruption and anti-Semitism. His words split the nation. Supporters of Dreyfus, known as Dreyfusards, clashed with those who saw him as guilty, the anti-Dreyfusards. Protests filled the streets, newspapers fueled the fury, and France stood bitterly divided. In 1899, Dreyfus was brought back for a retrial, convicted again, but soon pardoned. It was not until 1906, after years of legal battles and political upheaval, that France's highest court cleared his name entirely, reinstating him into the army. The Dreyfus Affair revealed the dangers of prejudice and secrecy within the military, shattered public trust in institutions, and left deep scars on French society. The My Lai Massacre. On March 16, 1968, in the quiet hamlet of My Lai, South Vietnam, the Vietnam War reached one of its darkest moments. U.S. soldiers from Charlie Company, under Lieutenant William Calley, entered the village on a mission to eliminate suspected Viet Cong fighters. Instead, it became a massacre. Over 4 hours, more than 500 unarmed civilians, men, women, children, and even infants, were slaughtered. Many women were assaulted, homes were destroyed, and survivors were left with lifelong scars. The horror might have remained hidden, but voices of conscience broke through. Helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson and his crew intervened to rescue villagers, while soldier Ronald Ridenour later exposed the atrocity, writing letters that forced the military to investigate. When the story surfaced in 1969, it shocked the American public and fueled outrage worldwide. Lieutenant Calley was the only man convicted, found guilty of murdering 22 civilians. Though sentenced to life, he served just 3 years under house arrest after President Nixon commuted his punishment. For many, this leniency deepened the scandal. The My Lai massacre became a symbol of the Vietnam War's moral collapse. It intensified anti-war protests, eroded trust in U.S. leadership. Today, the Sun My Memorial in Vietnam bears the names of the victims, ensuring the world never forgets. The Katyn Massacre Cover-Up. In the spring of 1940, in the Katyn Forest near Smolensk, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin authorized one of the most brutal wartime crimes. Over 22,000 Polish military officers, police, and intellectuals, prisoners of war taken after the Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939, were executed by the NKVD under Lavrenti Beria's orders. Their bodies were buried in mass graves, silencing much of Poland's leadership class in a single stroke. In April 1943, German forces uncovered the graves and announced the massacre to the world. The Soviet Union immediately denied responsibility, insisting the killings were committed by the Nazis after their 1941 invasion. To support this false claim, Moscow staged its own investigation, falsified documents, and pressured allies to accept the narrative. For decades, the truth was suppressed, while families of the victims were left in anguish, unable to speak openly under Soviet control. Throughout the Cold War, the Katyn cover-up stood as a glaring symbol of political manipulation. Western governments, including Britain and the United States, largely avoided pressing the issue during World War II to preserve their alliance with Stalin against Hitler. Only in April 1990 did the Soviet government finally admit the NKVD's responsibility, releasing documents that confirmed the scale of the massacre and the deliberate cover-up. The Katyn massacre remains one of the most infamous military scandals of the 20th century, an atrocity hidden in lies for half a century, and a lasting reminder of how power can bury truth but never erase it. By the way, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'll greatly appreciate it if you could show support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much. Nazi Wehrmacht war crimes. Between 1939 and 1945, the Wehrmacht, Nazi Germany's regular army, was not just a conventional fighting force. It became a key instrument of war crimes across Europe, complicit in atrocities that blurred the line between soldier and executioner. During the invasion of Poland and later the Soviet Union, Wehrmacht units burned villages, massacred civilians, and supported policies of racial extermination. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were captured, but instead of protection under the Geneva Conventions, they were left to starve, freeze, or die of disease in open-air camps. Historians estimate that more than 3 million Soviet POWs perished in German custody. The cruelty was not random. On June 6, 1941, the High Command issued the Commissar Order, directing troops to execute captured Soviet political officers immediately. By 1942, thousands of commissars had been shot, their deaths carried out under orders signed by generals such as Wilhelm Keitel. These crimes shattered the myth of a so-called clean German army. At Nuremberg, senior Wehrmacht leaders faced justice, with convictions for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Machil fake encounter. In Kashmir, a shadow of controversy has long followed the Indian Army through a series of fake encounter killings. From the 1990s onward, security forces were accused of staging gunfights, presenting civilians as militants, and killing them to claim rewards or promotions. The most infamous case took place in April 2010 in the Machil sector of Kupwara, near the line of control. 3 young men, Shahzad Ahmad Khan, Mohammad Shafi Lone, and Riaz Ahmad Lone, were lured from their homes with promises of work. Days later, the army announced they had eliminated 3 armed infiltrators from Pakistan. But when families reported them missing and protests erupted, an investigation revealed the truth. The men were innocent laborers, executed in cold blood. The revelations shocked India. In 2014, a military court-martial sentenced 6 soldiers, including a colonel and a captain, to life imprisonment, a rare conviction in cases involving the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which otherwise grants broad immunity to troops. Yet in 2017, many of these sentences were suspended, fueling outrage and reigniting debates on justice and accountability. For Kashmiris, the Machil case became a symbol of systemic abuse. It helped trigger the mass protests of 2010, when weeks of unrest and clashes with security forces left over 100 civilians dead. Human rights groups cited it as evidence of a wider pattern of impunity, pointing to unmarked graves and hundreds of alleged extrajudicial killings across the valley. The Machil fake encounter remains one of the gravest scandals in India's military history. The Iran-Contra affair. In the mid-1980s, the United States was rocked by a political and military scandal that came to be known as the Iran-Contra affair. Between August 1985 and March 1987, secret deals stretched from Washington to the Middle East and Central America, threatening the very credibility of the Reagan administration. The scheme had 2 parts. First, senior officials secretly arranged the sale of U.S. weapons to Iran, despite an embargo and official policy forbidding it. The justification was to gain leverage in freeing American hostages held in Lebanon by Hezbollah. But in a hidden twist, the profits from those arms sales were diverted to fund the Contras, a rebel group fighting Nicaragua's leftist Sandinista government, even though Congress had outlawed such support under the Boland Amendment. Key figures included Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the National Security Council, National Security Advisor John Poindexter, Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, and CIA Director William Casey. The scandal burst into the open in November 1986, after a Lebanese newspaper revealed the arms deals. Televised hearings soon followed, where Americans watched decorated military officers and senior officials admit to running unauthorized operations that blurred the line between national defense and covert war. The consequences were far-reaching. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh led prosecutions that resulted in multiple indictments and convictions, though many were later overturned on appeal or erased by pardons issued by President George H.W. Bush in 1992. President Reagan insisted he did not know of the diversion of funds, but his administration's credibility was permanently damaged. The Tailhook Scandal. In early September 1991, the Las Vegas Hilton hosted the U.S. Navy's 35th Annual Tailhook Association Symposium, a gathering meant to celebrate naval aviation. But instead of honor, it became a scandal that rocked the military to its core. Across that weekend, more than 80 women and several men reported being assaulted and harassed by Navy and Marine aviators. The most notorious scene unfolded in a third-floor hallway, where drunken officers formed a gauntlet, groping and attacking anyone who passed. Among the victims was Navy Lieutenant Paula Coughlin, whose decision to speak publicly exposed a culture of abuse and silence. The fallout was immediate and explosive. Initial Navy inquiries failed to hold perpetrators accountable, but when the Department of Defense Inspector General intervened, the scale of the misconduct was undeniable. The Secretary of the Navy, H. Lawrence Garrett, resigned in June 1992, and the careers of dozens of officers, including several admirals, collapsed under the weight of the scandal. Yet despite widespread misconduct, only a handful faced charges, and even those court-martial cases were dismissed. The tailhook scandal became a turning point in U.S. military history. It forced sweeping reforms in sexual harassment training, reporting, and accountability, and accelerated the opening of combat aviation roles to women in 1993. Abu Ghraib prison abuse. In April 2004, shocking photographs emerged from Abu Ghraib prison, just west of Baghdad, Iraq. Between October and December 2003, U.S. soldiers were documented abusing Iraqi detainees, forcing them into humiliating poses, stripping them naked, and subjecting them to physical and psychological torment. The revelations came through the Taguba Report, an internal U.S. Army investigation, which confirmed systematic abuse by members of the 372nd Military Police Company. 11 soldiers were eventually convicted, including Specialist Charles Grainer, sentenced to 10 years, and Private Lindy England, sentenced to 3. At least one detainee, Manadel al-Jamadi, died during interrogation. His death later ruled a homicide. The scandal deepened when the infamous photograph of a hooded prisoner standing on a box with wires attached to his body was broadcast by CBS's 60 Minutes. Second outrage swept across the globe. Senior officers faced criticism for leadership failures, but most escaped criminal charges, fueling debate over accountability. Abu Ghraib became a symbol of abuse and hypocrisy, severely damaging America's credibility in Iraq and across the Middle East. The prison itself was eventually closed in 2014. Fat Leonard Scandal. In the 2010s, the United States Navy became entangled in one of the most staggering corruption scandals in its history, the Fat Leonard Scandal. At the center was Leonard Glenn Francis, a Malaysian defense contractor based in Singapore, who ran Glenn Defense Marine Asia. Between 2006 and 2013, Francis bribed dozens of Navy officers with cash, luxury travel, lavish meals, prostitutes, and expensive gifts. In return, these officers leaked classified ship schedules and steered U.S. vessels toward ports controlled by his company, allowing him to inflate invoices and overcharge the Navy by tens of millions of dollars. The scandal reached its peak in 2013, when Francis was arrested during a sting operation in San Diego. Investigators uncovered a vast web of compromised officers, with more than 30 admirals and hundreds of personnel linked to the scheme, the largest corruption investigation in Navy history. Guilty pleas followed from both Francis and numerous officers, who admitted to betraying their positions of trust. But the story didn't end there. In September 2022, just weeks before sentencing, Francis escaped house arrest in San Diego by cutting off his ankle monitor and fleeing the country. He was captured days later in Venezuela and extradited to the United States. Finally, in November 2024, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison and ordered to pay millions in restitution. Somalia, Black Hawk Down. On October 3, 1993, in Mogadishu, Somalia, U.S. Special Forces launched Operation Gothic Serpent, a mission to capture lieutenants of warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid, whose militia had been attacking UN peacekeepers during the Somali Civil War. What was planned as a 1-hour raid turned into an 18-hour urban battle. During the operation, Somali fighters armed with rocket-propelled grenades shot down 2 Black Hawk helicopters. American soldiers found themselves trapped in the heart of Mogadishu, surrounded by thousands of hostile gunmen. Fierce firefights erupted as Rangers and Delta Force operators fought through narrow streets to reach the crash sites. Chief Warrant Officer Michael Durant, pilot of one helicopter, was captured after his crew was overwhelmed. Delta Force snipers Gary Gordon and Randy Shughart gave their lives defending the site, an act that later earned them the Medal of Honor. By the end, 18 American soldiers were killed, more than 70 wounded, and estimates of Somali deaths ranged from 300 to over 1,000, including both militia and civilians. The images of dead American soldiers dragged through the streets shocked the world. Public outrage forced the United States to withdraw its forces by March 1994. The incident exposed the dangers of urban warfare and reshaped U.S. foreign policy, leaving Black Hawk Down as both a story of extraordinary heroism and a stark lesson in the costs of military miscalculation. Soviet-Afghan War atrocities. The Soviet-Afghan War, fought from December 1979 to February 1989, became one of the darkest chapters of the Cold War. In a bid to support Afghanistan's fragile communist government, the Soviet Union launched a full-scale invasion. But what followed was not just a war of soldiers. It became a campaign of terror against civilians. Soviet forces, facing determined resistance from the Mujahideen, unleashed brutal tactics. Villages were bombed without warning, crops and livestock destroyed, and millions of landmines, some disguised as toys, were scattered across the countryside. Entire communities vanished in massacres. In 1982, around 180 villagers were killed in Padkhwab-e-Shana. In 1983, up to 360 people were executed in Balakars and surrounding villages. And in 1985, the Logman massacre claimed as many as 1,000 lives, with survivors recalling children mutilated and homes set ablaze. The human toll was staggering. By the war's end, between 850,000 and 1.5 million Afghans were dead, most of them civilians. Nearly 5 million fled across the borders into Pakistan and Iran, while millions more were displaced inside the country. Over 15,000 Soviet troops also lost their lives, leaving the Red Army scarred by a war it could not win. Globally, reports of atrocities sparked outrage. Human rights organizations condemned the Soviet campaign as deliberate war crimes, and many scholars have since argued it amounted to genocide. When the last Soviet troops withdrew in February 1989, Afghanistan lay in ruins, its villages destroyed, its people scattered, and its future destabilized for decades to come. The Haditha killings. In November 2005, the quiet Iraqi town of Haditha became the site of one of the darkest scandals of the Iraq War. On November 19th, a roadside bomb struck a U.S. Marine convoy, killing Lance Corporal Miguel Terrazas. What followed was an eruption of violence. In the hours after the blast, Marines swept through nearby homes, killing 24 Iraqi civilians, men, women, and children, many shot at close range. Initially, the military reported the deaths as the result of a fierce firefight with insurgents. But over time, photographs, survivor accounts, and investigative reporting told a different story. There had been no battle. The victims were unarmed. The cover-up unraveled when Time magazine published evidence in March 2006, forcing the military to launch a formal inquiry. 8 Marines were eventually charged, including Staff Sergeant Frank Wuterich, who led the squad that day. But as the years passed, case after case collapsed. By 2012, Wuterich stood as the last Marine facing consequences. He pleaded guilty only to negligent dereliction of duty. He received no prison time. The Haditha killings became a symbol of the Iraq War's human toll and a flashpoint for accusations of impunity within the U.S. military. For many Iraqis, it confirmed the sense that civilian lives had been treated as expendable. And for Americans, it raised an unsettling question. In war, where does accountability truly end? French Army torture scandal. From 1954 to 1962, Algeria fought a bloody war of independence against France. But behind the battles and street ambushes lay a darker scandal: systematic torture carried out by the French Army. Determined to break the National Liberation Front, French forces arrested thousands, holding them in secret detention centers where interrogations turned into brutal acts of violence. Survivors later described beatings, electrocution, and water torture, methods applied not only to fighters but also to civilians suspected of sympathy. The scandal reached its height during the Battle of Algiers in 1957. French paratroopers under General Jacques Massu were given sweeping powers to dismantle insurgent networks. They succeeded militarily, but their methods exposed France's darkest contradiction: a nation that championed liberty and democracy, yet sanctioned torture in its colonies. Testimonies from victims like journalist Henri Alleg, who published his account La Question, and confessions decades later by officers such as General Paul Ausareses confirmed what many already knew: thousands disappeared in the shadows of military rule. The impact was explosive. Intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre denounced the abuses, international outrage grew, and the scandal fractured French society itself. Though Algeria won independence in 1962, the revelations left deep scars. For decades, France avoided confronting this past, until recent acknowledgments by leaders like Emmanuel Macron confirmed state responsibility. Canadian Armed Forces sexual misconduct. In the 2010s, the Canadian Armed Forces became engulfed in a scandal that would shake the nation: the sexual misconduct crisis. Allegations of harassment and assault emerged from within the ranks, revealing not isolated incidents, but a culture where victims were often silenced and trust was broken. The turning point came in 2015, when former Supreme Court Justice Marie Deschamps released a report exposing a deeply entrenched sexualized environment in the military. Her findings forced the government to act, launching Operation Honor and creating the Sexual Misconduct Response Center. But promises of reform failed to stop the wave of allegations. By 2021, the crisis reached the highest levels of command. General Jonathan Vance, Canada's top military officer, was charged with obstruction of justice after being accused of inappropriate relationships with subordinates. His successor, Admiral Art MacDonald, and other senior officers, including Lieutenant General Trevor Cadieux, also faced misconduct allegations. Each revelation deepened the sense of betrayal among service members and the public. The fallout was enormous. More than 19,000 current and former members joined class action lawsuits, leading to one of the largest settlements in Canadian history. In December 2021, the government and military leaders issued a formal apology, acknowledging decades of failure. Investigations were transferred to civilian authorities, and billions were committed to compensation: the U.S. Marines Kill Team. In 2010, one of the most disturbing scandals of the Afghanistan war came to light. It became known as the Maiwand District Murders, or the Kill Team case, involving soldiers from the U.S. Army's 5th Stryker Brigade stationed at Forward Operating Base Ramrod in Kandahar Province. Between January and May of that year, at least 3 unarmed Afghan civilians were deliberately targeted and killed. The group, led by Staff Sergeant Calvin Gibbs, carried out staged combat encounters. They selected unarmed villagers, murdered them, and then planted weapons to make the deaths appear legitimate. Among the victims were Gul Muddin in January, Marak Aga in February, and Mullah Adadad in May. Soldiers photographed themselves with the bodies, and some even kept body parts, such as fingers, as gruesome trophies. The crimes unraveled when other members of the unit reported what they had witnessed. In March 2011, Specialist Jeremy Morlock pled guilty to 3 counts of premeditated murder, admitting he was part of a conspiracy to stage the killings. He was sentenced to 24 years in prison in exchange for testifying against others. Later that year, Gibbs was convicted of 3 murders, conspiracy, and assault. He received a life sentence. Other soldiers received prison terms ranging from 3 to 16 years, depending on their roles. The revelations sparked outrage in both Afghanistan and the United States. The scandal damaged trust between U.S. forces and Afghan civilians, fueled anti-American sentiment, and raised troubling questions about discipline and morality in war. Bagram and Kandahar detainee abuse. In the early years of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, 2 detention centers, Bagram Air Base and Kandahar Prison, became infamous for abuse and neglect. From 2002 onward, detainees captured during raids were held inside, but behind locked doors, disturbing practices emerged. Prisoners were subjected to beatings, prolonged shackling, sleep deprivation, and humiliation. The most shocking cases came in December 2002, when 2 Afghan men, Habibullah and Dilawar, a 22-year-old taxi driver, died at Bagram. Both were chained to the ceiling and repeatedly struck by U.S. soldiers. Autopsies ruled their deaths as homicides, noting severe blunt force injuries, with Dilawar's legs described as pulpified. Investigations led to charges against several low-ranking soldiers. Some received prison sentences and demotions, yet critics argued that accountability stopped short of senior officers who oversaw the system. Reports by Human Rights Watch and journalists later revealed that these abuses were not isolated but part of a wider pattern that predated the better-known scandal at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. Canadian Armed Forces sexual misconduct. In the 2010s, the Canadian Armed Forces became engulfed in a scandal that would shake the nation: the sexual misconduct crisis. Allegations of harassment and assault emerged from within the ranks, revealing not isolated incidents, but a culture where victims were often silenced and trust was broken. The turning point came in 2015, when former Supreme Court Justice Marie Deschamps released a report exposing a deeply entrenched sexualized environment in the military. Her findings forced the government to act, launching Operation Honor and creating the Sexual Misconduct Response Center. But promises of reform failed to stop the wave of allegations. By 2021, the crisis reached the highest levels of command. General Jonathan Vance, Canada's top military officer, was charged with obstruction of justice after being accused of inappropriate relationships with subordinates. His successor, Admiral Art MacDonald, and other senior officers, including Lieutenant General Trevor Cadieux, also faced misconduct allegations. Each revelation deepened the sense of betrayal among service members and the public. The fallout was enormous. More than 19,000 current and former members joined class action lawsuits, leading to one of the largest settlements in Canadian history. In December 2021, the government and military leaders issued a formal apology, acknowledging decades of failure. Investigations were transferred to civilian authorities, and billions were committed to compensation. If you enjoyed this, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much.